After the end of the Second World War, the Korean Peninsula, once united for centuries, became a prize of the new global rivalry. Japan's surrender in 1945 ended decades of colonial rule, but instead of independence came division. Along the 38th parallel, Soviet forces took control of the north, while American forces occupied the south. This division, meant to be temporary, soon hardened into a border. In the north, Kim Il-sung, backed by Moscow, built a communist state modeled after Stalin's Soviet Union. In the south, Syngman Rhee, supported by Washington, established an anti-communist republic. Both leaders dreamed of unifying the peninsula under their own vision, and both sides built armies while tension deepened. By 1949, American combat troops had largely withdrawn, leaving behind only advisors, while the Soviets trained and armed the north with tanks, artillery, and planes. The fragile peace was about to shatter. On the morning of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a massive surprise invasion. With Soviet-supplied 34 tanks at the front, waves of infantry crossed the 38th parallel, smashing through unprepared South Korean defenses. Artillery thundered, aircraft struck, and chaos consumed the Southern Army. Within 3 days, Seoul, the capital, fell to the invaders. Columns of refugees fled southward, while Northern soldiers hoisted red flags over the city. President Harry Truman declared that communist aggression must not succeed, and the United Nations Security Council, boycotted at the time by the Soviets, passed a resolution to defend South Korea. An international coalition was formed, with American forces at its core, joined by troops from Britain, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and many others. But through July and August, the northern advance seemed unstoppable. South Korean and UN forces were driven into a small pocket around the southern port of Pusan. The Pusan Perimeter, as it became known, was held desperately against constant attacks. Supplies and reinforcements poured in across the sea from Japan, and slowly the defense held. Yet the situation remained dire. The entire peninsula could be lost. It was in this moment of crisis that General Douglas MacArthur proposed a bold and risky counterstroke. In September of 1950, UN forces launched a daring amphibious assault at the port of Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The Incheon landing was one of the most audacious operations of the war. Strong tides, narrow channels, and fortified positions made it extremely dangerous. In a matter of weeks, the tide of war had completely reversed. The once victorious North Korean army was collapsing, fleeing northward in disarray. By October of 1950, UN and South Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, pushing deep into North Korea. Pyongyang, the northern capital, fell, and MacArthur's armies advanced all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China. The war seemed nearly over, victory within reach, but on the other side of the river, Mao Zedong was preparing a massive intervention. For China, hostile armies on its border were unacceptable. In late October, waves of Chinese People's Volunteers crossed secretly into Korea. At first, their presence was barely noticed. Then, in November, they struck with overwhelming force. The Chinese offensive crashed into overextended UN troops, surrounding divisions and sending them into retreat. By December of 1950, UN forces had been driven back below the 38th parallel. Seoul once again fell to communist forces. The war that seemed almost won was now thrown into chaos. In early 1951, UN forces regrouped. With fresh reinforcements and superior firepower, they launched counterattacks. Seoul was retaken for the second time, and front lines stabilized roughly along the original dividing line. The war had become a bloody stalemate. From spring 1951 onward, both sides dug in along ridges and valleys, building trenches and bunkers reminiscent of the First World War. In the skies, American jets like the F-86 Sabre faced Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters, piloted not only by Koreans and Chinese, but also secretly by Soviet aviators. Dogfights over MiG Alley in northwestern Korea became legendary, ushering in the jet age of aerial combat. At the same time, the human cost of the war mounted relentlessly. Civilians on both sides endured mass killings, refugee crises, hunger, and devastation. By 1951, both sides recognized that outright victory was unlikely, and peace talks began at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. Yet the negotiations dragged on endlessly. The main issue was not territory, which remained deadlocked near the 38th parallel, but the fate of prisoners of war. Many captives from the north refused repatriation, fearing punishment if they returned, while the communists demanded their forced return. This dispute prolonged the conflict for 2 more bloody years, through 1952 and into 1953. The war settled into a grinding war of attrition. Both sides launched limited offensives to seize key hills or improve defensive lines, but the front remained largely unchanged. Meanwhile, the wider Cold War shaped decisions. In the United States, President Truman gave way to Dwight Eisenhower, who promised to end the war. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's death in March of 1953 shifted the communist stance, making compromise possible. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The fighting stopped, but no peace treaty was ever concluded. The Korean peninsula remained divided almost exactly where it had been in 1945, along the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone, heavily fortified, was established between the two states, a scar that endures to this day. The cost of the Korean War was staggering. Millions of Korean civilians were killed or displaced. North and South Korea were left shattered, their cities in ruins, their people traumatized. More than 36,000 American soldiers died, along with tens of thousands from other UN nations. China lost hundreds of thousands, perhaps more. The war cemented the division of Korea, a division that still defines global politics. It also marked the first major armed clash of the Cold War, setting the pattern for proxy wars and confrontations to come. The Korean War has often been called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the Second World War before it and the Vietnam War that followed. Yet for those who lived through it, it was unforgettable, a brutal struggle of ideology, survival, and national identity. The images of refugees on snowy roads, of Marines trudging through frozen valleys, of Seoul changing hands 4 times, of jets dueling in the sky, and of negotiators arguing for months while soldiers died in the mud, all tell the story of a war that never truly ended. Even today, the Korean peninsula remains divided, a reminder that the armistice of 1953 was not peace but merely a pause. The war's shadow lingers across generations, shaping the destinies of millions and reminding the world how fragile peace can be when rival powers collide.